Amen. Let's all stand together as we're going to read some verses. 1 Timothy chapter 5. We're going to start in verse number 1. Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren, the older women as mothers, the younger as sisters with all purity. Honor widows that are widows indeed. But if any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. Now she that is a widow indeed and desolate trusteth in God and continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. But she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. These things give in charge, that they may be blameless. But if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith, and is worse than an infidel. Let not a widow be taken into the number under 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, well reported of for good works. If she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers, if she have washed the saints' feet, if she have relieved the afflicted, if she have diligently followed every good work. But the younger widows refuse, for when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry, having damnation, because they have cast off their first faith. And withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things they ought not. Boy, I wonder how many people online have already cut us off after reading this text. I mean, you can't, you hear, you walk out, everyone's going to know it, but I'm just kidding. Not really, but. I will, therefore, verse 14, that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some are already turned aside after Satan. If any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. Tonight I would like to preach from this text on the thought of Christian compatibility. Christian compatibility. You can be seated. Thank you so much for standing. Thus far, this pastoral epistle has dealt with Timothy's self primarily. Paul urged him to behave thyself in chapter 3 and verse number 15. To exercise thyself in chapter 4 and verse number 7. To give thyself in chapter 4 and verse 15. And then to take heed unto thyself and to save thyself in chapter 4 and verse number 16. God has focused on the personal side of Christianity. Now there is a personal side of Christianity. It is up to you to stop sinning. It is up to you to read your Bible. It is up to you to exercise thyself to godliness. It is up to you to behave thyself. I cannot behave for you. No preacher can behave for you. There is a personal side where you have to take into consideration your own will, your own mind, your own habits, your own time, and your own heart, and your own day, and in your own sphere of life, and you have to make decisions. Christianity is a personal thing. But now in chapter 5, the focus shifts from not just the personal side, but to the personnel side. He's got to deal with elders, younger men, elder women, younger women, and widows. He's got to, Timothy as a young pastor, has to interact with all of these age groups, all of these people groups that are represented in the church. And Timothy has got to become compatible. Now, the very first word of chapter 5, what is it? Say it out loud. What is it? Rebuke. Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father. So, Timothy, how are you going to interact with these other Christians? Paul has dealt a lot with himself, with his own holiness, with his own doctrine, and with the personal side, but he is now focusing on dealing with other people. And when confrontation arises, and that is the subject, rebuke not an elder, implying that the elder is in error and must be spoken to, must be corrected, must be guided back to the truth. So Timothy, as a young pastor, how are you going to deal with that? When confrontation arises, when somebody is wrong, how are you going to handle that? How are you going to talk to them? How are you going to treat them? He says, rebuke not, implying that somebody needed to be rebuked or needed to be corrected. And Timothy had to become compatible with other Christians. He had to be compatible with old men. He had to be compatible with old women. He had to be compatible with young men, which might be the hardest of all. He had to be compatible with young women. He had to be compatible. And I just want to present to you that most church trouble is not doctrinal, but relational. There are some churches that do split over doctrinal issues. That does happen. But the majority of church splits and church fights are relational, not doctrinal. Most Christians' problems are rooted in dysfunctional relationships with other Christians. I know the world's bad, and I know the blue side, the red side. I know all that. But most of our problems are not with lost people, they're with saved people. Uncompatible. Where an old man and a young man can't agree. Or a young woman and an old woman can't they can't go to church together because they're so different. They're so different. When we're almost from different worlds. We've got now what we call digital natives. And I was talking to Miss Barbara earlier this week, and she was talking about when her husband Melvin, they tried to do a FaceTime call, like a Zoom talk or whatever, and he was like, "What? I don't even understand what you're saying. I don't get any of this." But my 7-year-old, he FaceTimes all the time. We're from different worlds. We're from different time zones. I mean, not time zones, but we're from different times. Some of you can remember going to school without shoes. Some of you took a school picture and only one kid had shoes on. It was all right to just walk to school and at 10 years old drive your daddy's truck to the store. And it's not the world we live in anymore. We are, so to speak, from different worlds, and we are diverse. Now, this congregation that Timothy was placed in charge of was a very diverse congregation. Old men, old women, young men, young women. And wherever young men and young women are present, there will also be children. And so this is a diverse congregation, but just because it is a diverse congregation does not mean it has to be a dysfunctional congregation. Just because it is a diverse congregation does not mean that it has to be a dysfunctional one. Many in this time that we live, they do not want a diverse congregation. Older folks want an old folks' church. Younger people want a young people's church. But could you imagine a church with only fathers? Or a church with only mothers? A church with only young men? I mean, they might have all the strength in the world, but they don't have the wisdom to, get through and navigate a problem. Or they might have all the gray hair you could find and have all the wisdom you could find, but none of them get up because their backs hurt and they've all got arthritis and they're all past that time of life. Churches need a diversity. We need each other. You understand? We need one another. And, the goal is not to be clones of one another. The goal is to be compatible with one another. Paul said it like this: to be all things to all men. To be all things to all men. Now, an inspiring note for the young people in here that aspire for ministry, it was God's idea that Timothy, a young man, pastor all of these age groups while he only belonged to one. That was God's idea, that the pastor of this diverse church, even though he's not an old man, pastor old men. Even though he's not a woman pastor women. Now, his predecessor was Paul the aged. They went from an older pastor to a young pastor. Not many congregations can survive that kind of transition, because a young pastor has completely different responsibilities than an old pastor who doesn't have a family like the Apostle Paul. It's very different. It's very different. But it was God's idea that he become the pastor, and obviously it was God's idea that Paul was the first pastor. And I believe that God ordains old men and young men. I support old pastors and young pastors. I'm for both. And this challenges a young Timothy to grow beyond his years, and it challenges a congregation to not despise a man's youth. Like verse number 12, let no man despise thy youth. And so this congregation is going to have to become compatible if they're going to survive. This congregation that's diverse by age, probably diverse by ethnicity as well, is going to have to be able to become compatible. They're going to have to be able to get along. And these verses that we have read tonight are a treasure house of wisdom for how to be compatible together. Now, as I said a minute ago, I will say this again. Most Christians' problems are rooted in dysfunctional relationships with other Christians. Here, Timothy is getting a crash course on how to deal with other Christians. So, Paul, if we could sit down and ask him, how do we become compatible? How do I, as a young man, how do I deal with other Christians from different age groups? Well, we're going to see, number one, our approach to other Christians. Our approach to other Christians. Look at verse 1 with me. Rebuke not an elder, but, say the word, entreat him as a father. Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father. Now, again, this rebuke situation is very indicative that even an older person could need to be corrected. Even an older man possesses the propensity to be wrong. I mean, that might not be often, but it might happen. And we could say it like this: you never get too old to need a pastor. You never get too old to need a pastor. Now, an older pastor wrote this, and I have to read this to you because I read this and it was a blessing. So I'm going to read it to you. An older pastor, he wrote this when he came to this text. He said, given Timothy's timidness and his natural distaste for confrontation, it was very possible that he might first rehearse his rebuke so that he could articulate it. Then, with his adrenaline pumping, muster up his courage, approach the erring elder, and spit it out like an Old Testament prophet, leaving the impression that he neither respected the man's age nor cared for him personally. He followed it up with this little statement: tone is so important in ministry. And his perspective was that if a young pastor has to deal with the error of an older man, it's as difficult and uncomfortable and weird and awkward for him as it is that older man that has to be corrected. And he could be in his office sweating bullets and going over it and going over it and going over it, probably writing it out to make sure he's got all of his words counted and all of his words exactly how he wants to say it. And then he finally gets to go talk to the man, and he's so geared up and so psyched up, it just all flies out, and it just is a disaster. I've done my best to not let that happen to myself. I don't know how well of a job I've done, but I have tried. But the inspired counsel from Paul to Timothy was to entreat like a father. Now, the word entreat, Exodus chapter 8, verse number 8, then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, entreat the Lord for me, that he may take away from me the frogs and from my people. Entreat the Lord for me. In 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse number 25, if one man sin against another, the judge shall judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who shall entreat for him? In 1 Kings 13 and verse number 6, the king answered and said unto the man of God, entreat now the face of the Lord thy God, and pray for me that my hand may be restored me again. And so entreat is our approach. It's our approach. Now, you would never barge in and start yelling at God. Pharaoh said, I can go talk to him. Would you please go entreat for me? Would you please go in before me? It's about our approach. You can't help but see the word treat in entreat. And in part of being compatible with other Christians, it all boils down to how we treat one another. How we treat one another. Now, when you get mad about the sin of an older man in the church, why don't you just treat him like that was your father? Because I would almost guarantee that you're not as apt to go yell and name call at your daddy as you are the old man at church you're mad at. You have an innate inhibition inside your being that when you get around your parents, your attitude changes when you're mad. You don't just boss them around. And so if we're upset with an older person at church, we are to entreat them like a father. Now, this passage does not teach us to leave the older men in their error, but to approach the error with the same respect as you would your father. The command is to entreat, not to ignore. To entreat. So many times I get so frustrated. I'm thankful that I'm a young man. I'm thankful to be in my 30s and all that good stuff, to be born in the era that I was born in. You know, people hear people say all the time, I was born in the wrong century. I was not born in the wrong century. I was built for air conditioning. I was built for Wi-Fi. I was built for a nice vehicle and not a horse and a wagon. Like I'm all for it, you know. I have no idea what I was about to say. I got distracted by air conditioning. I mean, I'm talking about Brother Dylan. It left. I mean, Elvis has left the building, son. It was great, too, let me tell you. It was probably the greatest thing you were going to hear all night, and now you won't. He was waiting on it. Brother Bo was excited. He was like, yeah, give it to me, preacher, come on. It'll come back in a minute, right at the invitation. We're about to have a spiritual moment, and I'll tell you what it was. But we're talking about I do remember what it was. I'm glad I'm a younger person. But sometimes I get I'm appalled at many young, my age group Christians that can't stand, they can't stand anything older than them. They can't stand old people at church. They can't stand their habits. They can't stand their traditions. They can't stand the old-time way. They can't stand none of it. And they mock it, and they make fun of it, and they ridicule it, and they make out like it's the plague. That gets on every nerve I have, and I have a lot of nerves, and it gets on all of them. And probably the main reason why that gets on my nerves so bad is because if it were not for the generation of Baptists before us, we would not have what we have today. We would not have what we have today. And all these little boys run around pitching little fits and all these little rants online about, old-time religion and all this stuff. Most of them got saved in an independent, fundamental Baptist church. They did not get saved in a non-denominational church down the street. They did not get saved in any of those things. They got saved from the outreach of an independent, fundamental Baptist church. And how ungrateful, how spoiled rotten, how ridiculously bratty of my generation to look back at the older generation and pick them apart as if they were unnecessary. Were they right at everything? No. Is my generation right at everything? Absolutely not. We're probably wrong in more ways than they were, just different. And so when you're upset up towards the elderly in church, you must entreat them as a father. You must entreat them as a father. Let's move on because I was starting to get it in the flesh, I think, right there. So there's slippery slopes when you're preaching. There are slippery slopes. It's a fine line between righteous indignation and absolute irritation. It's just there's a fine line. I thank God for the heritage. Thank God for the heritage. Thank God for the old men that invested their life and their family and their bodies and their minds to the ministry that poured into my life. I'm thankful. Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father. See, the problem with our generation is now they talk to their father like they talk to a kid in the playground. Then he says, and the younger men as brethren. And the younger men as brethren. To entreat the younger men as brethren, those closer to your age, they are to be treated like brothers. Now, I've never had a brother. I've had two sisters. I've never had a brother. So I had to think a while and pray a while and read a lot of Scripture to, Lord, teach me about this whole brother business. Well, the first brothers was Cain and Abel. Pretty sure that's not what God meant. Jacob and Esau were brothers. Quite sure that's not what God meant. Joseph had 11 brothers. Let's talk about them. So, Brother William, maybe we needed to throw some of these in a pit and sell them and see what we can get for them on like a church draft. You know what I'm saying? And, I'm just kidding. But the Bible is full of brothers that were not compatible. This Bible is honest, and it's full of brothers that couldn't get along. It's full of brothers that fought, some to the death. It's full of brothers that were not compatible, and the church seems to still be plagued with the same brotherly dysfunction. Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 17, a friend loveth at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Jesus says some very strong words in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 22. He said, I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hell fire. Therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, then come offer thy gift. The very first sermon I ever preached was from Hebrews chapter 13 and verse number 1. Let brotherly love continue. And so as brothers, God expects us to love one another through adversity. He expects us to be right with one another through reconciliation. God does not expect brothers to never disagree. If you want two guys to disagree, make sure they're brothers and they will disagree on everything. God does not expect for there to never be a problem, but what He does expect is for it to be reconciled. And before you can go forward with your offering to God, with your gifts to God, with your worship, with your ministry, with your prayer life, you got to make sure things are reconciled with your brother. Let brotherly love continue. So we are to be there for one another through adversity. We are to be right with each other through reconciliation, and we are to love one another like family. So entreat the younger men like brothers. Now, these troubled brothers in Scripture, they just couldn't let their brothers be themselves. Cain just could not let Abel be more right than him. There's no way you're going to be more right than I am. And he wound up killing him. Joseph's brothers couldn't bear the thought that their little brother was destined for greatness, and they weren't. So they threw him in a pit, and they said, we will see what shall become of his dreams. They couldn't bear the thought of God using him over them. God's going to use... No. You know, that same spirit permeates the church today. God will call a particular man in a ministry and no. People will fight tooth and nail. Oh, I've seen it. Absalom couldn't stand the thought of his brother Amnon's sin not going unpunished. So he kills him himself. That's no way to treat your brother. That to literally, like Cain, stand up to the face of God and resist the conviction of God because your younger brother or your brother was more right than you. That's no way to treat your brother. And then to go get mad and fight him and kill him. And many people have jumped through so many hoops to justify Cain. I don't know. Joseph's brothers are the ultimate example of a bad brother. That's no way to treat your brother. Absalom holding on to the sin, and I understand Amnon's sin was grotesque and wicked and sinful. But for Absalom to hold on to his brother's sin and to judge it himself, that's no way to treat your brother. And unfortunately, within the church, a brother messes up, and if he's given mercy and some other brother finds out about it, oh, no, sir. No. That's no way to treat your brother. Well, that was fun, wasn't it? Verse 2, the elder women as mothers. The elder women as mothers. Romans chapter 16 and verse number 13, Paul said, salute Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine. Now, the Apostle Paul's mother was not the same mother of Rufus. They were not brothers. But Rufus' mother had taken on a motherly role in the church at Rome, and she had taken on a motherly position in the life of the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul realized that, and he commended her for it, and he thanked God for it, and he honored her when he wrote Romans chapter number 16. He viewed this lady like a mother. In Titus chapter 2, Paul writes about the aged women that they are to assume a motherly role in the church with the men and with the young women. You know, when I grew up, I was privileged to grow up around several women who fulfilled that role. I'm thinking about Miss Janice Dyer, my first Sunday school teacher, and how she's just such a good example of, it's not hard to view Miss Janice Dyer at church as a mother. I think about Miss Irene Clausen. Some of the folks from Happy Valley will say amen to this. Miss Irene Clausen, to me, she is the standard for thoughtfulness. She is the standard of thoughtfulness, and she is a blessing. And I was able to grow up around her. Miss Tammy Austin, who comes to church here, she has a special place in my heart, and she's not here tonight, so I can talk about her. And if you're listening, just pause it or something, or skip it. Miss Tammy she's stepped in as like a motherly role in our life and in our ministry, and she loves me to a fault, and I appreciate her and I love her. But one cannot read this text, the elder women as mothers. One cannot read this text without thinking of Jesus' words from the cross. John, behold thy mother. So the next time you're pitching a fit about what that old woman at church did, would you talk to your mama like that? Would you talk to your mama about your mama like that? Would you badmouth your mama like that? I highly doubt it. To view them as mothers. To view them as mothers. That's our approach. It's all about how we approach one another. Churches can become compatible when they approach each other right. Number 2, let's look at this in verse 2. The elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters with all purity. The younger as sisters with all purity. So first we noticed our approach to other Christians. Secondly, I want to talk about our attraction to other Christians. our attraction to other Christians. Now, Paul is not stupid. He knows that he is Paul the aged and Timothy was Timothy the young. And he knows that in every church there are young men, young women. Timothy's a pastor. He'll be pastoring young women. You know, this has always been a vulnerability to ministries. It's where Satan will meddle first. It's also where Satan has had terrible success. And boy, y'all look as uncomfortable and nervous. But the church must learn to navigate platonic relationships. The inspired advice to Timothy is to view the younger women as sisters with all purity. Now, while verse 1 talks about how we talk to others or about others, verse 2 addresses how we think about others. We are to think of the younger women as sisters with all purity. Now, I have two sisters. I have an older sister named Ashley and a younger sister named Katie. Both of them are beautiful ladies, and I recognize their beauty, but to think anything immoral is repulsive, unnerving. To think anything else, I'd rather just die. Church history, both ancient and modern, would have far fewer scandals if this verse were taken to heart. When I was a boy, the first fight I ever got into was with my neighbor. He was a few years older than me, about 4 or 5 years, and we were sitting outside one day, and this boy was a ball player, was an athlete, and he was in really good shape, and he was just strong, and he called my older sister, and he said, "She's ugly as a dog." I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I mean, he's 5 years older than me. I just pushed him off the swing. You can't do that, man. You can't say that about my sister. Well, a beatdown commenced. I mean, not his beatdown, my beatdown. And a little jerk beating up a little kid. What's wrong with that guy? But he started wailing on me. But God had foreordained that fight, I believe, and placed a limb right there on the dirt. And I just grabbed it, hit him right in the head, and he took off running. And you say, who won the fight? The one that didn't run away crying. That's the one that won the fight. That's how I judge who won a fight. Whoever didn't run away crying, that's who won. I don't care how black my eye was or how bloody my lip was or my nose or the other eye. I won the fight because I didn't run away crying. But he called my sister ugly as a dog. Boy, you can't do that. That's my sister. I was in the first grade, and not long after that, I got my first yearbook. I brought that yearbook home. And me and him, of course, we made up after that. And we were sitting on the front porch looking at my yearbook. And we were going through my class. Honey, I do apologize for this illustration in advance. And, we got to my class, and we was going through there, and we got to a particular picture, and I said, I kind of like that girl. And he said, "You like her?" And he pointed, and I said, "Yeah." He said, "She's ugly as a dog." And then he, like, last time you said that, you got a stick upside your head. But he said, "She's ugly as a dog." And I just said, "Well, I don't think so." And I just rolled right along. He said the same thing to the same person about two girls that were important to him. It was so different results. Why? When it was my sister, there was an instinct that just burst out of nowhere. Next thing I knew, I've got a 14-year-old pushed on the ground. I'm standing over him. I didn't think about it. It was instinct. It was just a natural birth reaction. It was just an organic thing. Now, when he called Becky ugly as a dog, that didn't really bother me all that much. But when it was my sister, oh. Now, this instinct toward this instinct between men and women in the church, this brother-sister thing, this instinct, it needs to be It needs to be natural. It needs to be instinctive and immediate. Anything contrary to it is earthly, sensual, and devilish. Timothy was to treat the women in the church with the same chaste manner and protection he would his own flesh and blood sister. If you will read Romans chapter 16, as Paul writes this long list of names he is commending, at least 10 of them are women. At least 10 of them are. Now, there could be more, but this is the best ones that I can find. There's at least 10. Now, a carnal, sensual man could have never written such a commendation. Boy, how much grief the modern church could have been spared had this one dictum been taken to heart. And pastoral warmth can be easily misinterpreted and also easily exploited. We're to view each other brother and sister. Paul has given us a rich storehouse of relational wisdom, full span of age and gender. How beautiful a church that has people who know who they are and how to treat one another like fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters. That's our approach. That is our attraction. Lastly, and I will say this as quickly as I can, our accountability to other Christians. In verse 3 through verse number 16, Paul now picks up the church's oldest problem, caring for widows. It was the first major issue in Acts chapter number 6. Parts of the congregation felt that the pastors were neglecting their widows. And decades later, in another country, but inspired by the same God, Paul writes 14 verses of instruction for this very topic. In Exodus 22, in verse 22, God said, "Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless." Caring for widows is a big part of God's culture. Caring for widows is a big part of God's culture. Widows had a special place in Jesus' heart. You'll remember in Luke 7, the widow of Nain came out with that boy, and Jesus raised that boy back to life. In Luke 17, the widow's 2 mites, and Jesus said she's given him more than all of them have. In Acts chapter 6, 7 men were employed to care for the widows of the church. In James 1 and verse 27, he said, "Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world." And we are accountable to God to care for our widows. This aspect of church culture had been abused, though, by the time Timothy was pastoring in Ephesus. And Timothy was to perform an intervention of sorts with some very, very tough directives. In verse 3, honor widows that are widows indeed. But if any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. And so first, her family must be considered. If any widow have children, you'll notice immediately it does not say if a widow have sons. It said children. Because a daughter's husband becomes liable to God for the care of his mother-in-law. Then it says, or nephews. It broadens the family accountability even further. And how many families have grieved God by ignoring their family responsibilities because they guilt-trip the church into doing their job? Verse 8 is still in the Bible, "But if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel." Worse than an infidel. One historian I read after on this verse, he said that all Roman pagans did take care of their parents. It was a part of their culture. And most of the lost world still does today. Why is it a problem with Christians, though? For the same reason, nobody likes to work for a church because they know they're not going to get paid. They don't like to work for Christians because they know they're not going to get paid. And businessmen will a lot of times take a Bible verse or a cross or a fish sign off of their merchandise because they don't want people to think they're a Christian because people think Christians are lazy. And there is a certain laziness that is prone to Christians who have received much they did not earn or deserve. They start to view everything like that. This is worse than an infidel. And so families that will not care for their own, to God, that's worse than an infidel. You're worse than an unbeliever. You're worse than a lost man going to hell because you won't care for your own family. That's her family. Second, her feebleness. In verse number 9, let not a widow be taken into the number under 60 years old. I met a widow today, of all days. She's definitely under 60 years old. And she was in the middle of complaining about, she had hired a construction crew, brother, to build a garage. And they weren't doing it right, so she fired them and finished it herself. Wow. It's impressive. And she said, I had to build that garage because that's where I parked my dump truck. I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said. Your what truck? My dump truck. And then she walked out of the store and got in her Hummer and drove off. And I thought, you were the manliest woman I have ever met in my life. Now, she is a widow, but she doesn't need any help. You drive a dump truck, build a garage, her feebleness. Then thirdly, there's her faithfulness. Verse 5, he said, now she that is a widow indeed, and desolate, which means alone, trusteth in God, and continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. Reminds me of Anna there in the book of Luke when Mary and Joseph brought Jesus to the temple when he was 8 days old. Y'all remember the prophetess Anna? She was a widow and she continued in prayers night and day. Look at verse 10. She is well reported of for good works. If she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers, if she have washed the saints' feet, if she have relieved the afflicted, if she have diligently followed every good work. Verse 10 begins to contrast a woman that had been faithful to God and then a woman that had not. Verse number 11, but the younger widows refuse. Well, that's a strong word. Refuse. Let's just read the verse. For when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry, having damnation, because they have cast off their first faith. And withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house. And not only idle, but tattlers also, busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some are already turned aside after Satan. If any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. And so there are widows that are financially qualified. That's not the dump truck driving, Hummer driving, garage building lady. That's not financially qualified. There are financial, then there are spiritually qualified. She might be broke. She also might be a heathen. So verse number 16, it sums up the issue. If any man or woman, if any son or daughter, you could say. Now, the church is a family. And treat like a father. And treat like a brother. And treat like a mother. And then treat like a sister. The church is a family. Somebody say amen. But it does not replace the family when it's convenient or cheaper. The church is a family, but it does not replace the family when it's convenient or when it's cheaper. We've had families get mad, get frustrated for not caring when the family is ignoring their God-ordained responsibilities. In verse number 4, he said, let them first show piety at home and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. Good and acceptable before God. And so this compatibility on how to interact with the elderly, with those as within our age bracket, the younger as brothers, the younger women as sisters, and then the widows, those widows indeed that we are accountable for, that God holds the church accountable for. And then there are those within the family that God's holding some people accountable. And just because you've neglected that does not mean that God's looked over it. And he said that's worse than an infidel. If a man won't take care of his own, it's worse than an infidel. And so he sums it up. If any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed.